Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening at Archives Unlocked online series. This evening's topic is highlights from the Straits Settlements Records. We are happy to have with us Ms. Fiona Tan, an archivist with the Records Management Department at the National Archives of Singapore. She was previously posted to the Archives Reading Room, where she enjoyed discussing with users how to research the Straits Settlements Records. We also have Ms. Christabel Khoo, who is an Assistant Archivist with the Records Management Department at the National Archives of Singapore. She previously oversaw the Citizen Archivist Project and has seen firsthand how the Straits Settlement Records have continued to engage new researchers. I will now pass on the session to Fiona and Christabel. Thank you.
So, hi everyone. Just a quick overview of our presentation today. So we'll be covering a quick overview of the history of the Straits Settlements Records, my personal favorite topic. How to access them, also something that I think I have brought many users in the Archives Reading Room with. And then Christabel will take over and talk about more exciting things, such as how it is currently being displayed on the Citizen Archivist Project and sort of activated through crowdsourcing, and some of the highlights that was previously on exhibition at an exhibition called On Paper, Singapore Before 1867. So before I start, maybe we ignore this laundry list of dates, but basically what I really wanted to highlight is what exactly are the Straits Settlements. So the Straits Settlements was a political entity that was formed in 1826 that consisted of Singapore, Penang, which was then known as the Prince of Wales Island, and Malacca. And it was administered by a British governor who was assisted by 3 resident councillors, each in charge of each of the constituent settlements. And the headquarters of the Straits Settlements also moved several times. So initially it was based in Penang, and later on it was shifted to Singapore in 1832. Subsequently, it was sort of removed from the dependency of Bengal and placed under the direct control of the Governor General of India. It came under the administration of the India office, and it was subsequently transferred to the Colonial office based in London and became a crown colony. So this really is just to explain how the records are understandably scattered. If you're interested in the Straits Settlements period, you'll basically be looking at 3 major sets of records. So firstly, it would be the India Office records that are held by the British Library, the East India Company records that are also held by the National Archives of India, given the fact that at a certain point of time, the Straits Settlements came under the administration of India. And what's left in Singapore, the copies that are left behind in Singapore and the Straits Settlements, which will be the topic of our discussion today, is basically the Straits Settlements records that I'll be discussing further. So what is the beginnings of the Straits Settlements records? Now the image on the left there is a cover that is entitled The Early Records of the Government of the Straits Settlements deposited in the Colonial Secretary's Library. And very interestingly, somebody decided to cancel in the cancellation and correct it to Raffles Museum and Library. So this was actually one of the first listings, detailed listings that we know of what exactly was contained within this particular set of collections. And it was published in 1928 by Lieut, who was the Secretary of the Colonial Secretariat. And he actually declared that he based it on an earlier listing done by Dr. Gilbert Brooke. And Dr. Gilbert Brooke was actually one of the 3 editors of the seminal 100 Years of Singapore. And you can see an image of the book on the bottom center. And when he was doing research for this 100 Years of Singapore, he had actually gone to the Colonial Secretariat based in Singapore and did sort of a extensive research into the early colonial history of Singapore, all the way back to 1819. And so he had done, I guess, a somewhat rudimentary listing, which unfortunately we have not been able to locate. So all we know is from this published 1928 publication that it was actually that it was not the first, but unfortunately we do not have the very first listing that was actually done about it. And on the right-hand side is one of the Colonial Office records, which actually first mentions this set of records as a cohesive collection. So over here, I have a little screenshot of the letters that was sent in 1914, and it actually highlights it so that it's bigger. So it actually describes that there were older records from the foundation of the Straits Settlements to 1867, when they were transferred to the charge of the Colonial Office, which are bound up in over 1,000 volumes, mostly in manuscript, and was stored very recently on a high wooden bookcase. Now, of course, how this 1,000 volumes were separated, we are not very sure. But by the time it was listed in Lay's listing, it was really only about 170 to about 200 volumes, which were sort of reorganized by alphabetical. By several alphabetical series, and each of these series sort of represent like a certain topic. So for instance, there will be like letters to governor, letters from governor, there will be letters from native rulers, letters to native rulers. So there were all these like sort of broad subject or topical kinds of organization, and then within each of these volumes, it was roughly arranged chronologically. And I like to call this set of records Singapore's founding archival collections, in the sense that it really formed the basis of the beginnings of Singapore's archives. So in 1938, the Singapore's first archivist was hired. In fact, you see a newspaper article there sort of featuring the photograph of our very first archivist, Mr. Tan Su-Chai. And he was, according to the news and the annual reports, he was hired to index and catalogue 170 large bound volumes dealing with the early administration of the Straits Settlements, which was transferred from the care to the care of the Raffles Museum and Library, a photo of which is shown on the top right, from the Colonial Secretariat in 1939. And in 1940, it was reported that he was done with his work, where a comprehensive index recording every person, event, and institution mentioned in the original documents of all records relating to the Straits Settlements in the series was compiled. And I have on the bottom left some images of the index to the Straits Settlements records. It is actually a negative microfilm copy of it. That's why it's black. The background is black in color. But here you see that it was actually a mixture of typewritten and handwritten index. So at some point of time, I suppose somebody must have translated it. But I do believe that based on the handwriting, the one on the rightmost is Tan Su-Chai's own handwriting, because it also appears in some of the original volumes as well. So there you have it, his original handwritten index to the Straits Settlements records. During the wartime, the Straits Settlements records was moved from the Raffles Museum and Library to the Raffles College for safekeeping. And in 1944, E.J.H. Corner, who was then the director, he was appointed as the caretaker for the Raffles Museum and Library, as well as the Botanical Gardens. And together with his Japanese counterpart, Hidezo Tanaka Date, he tried to rescue some of these Straits Settlements records. And he has a very excitingly written account of how he actually discovered what happened to them in some of the other volumes in his memoirs, The Marquis. So over here, you have here, so he says, in September 1945, my attention was drawn to a line of Chinese women laborers jogging down Holland Road, past the main entrance to the gardens, and carrying in pickle baskets what appeared to be old books. They were some of the missing volumes being taken away for sale as waste paper. I bought the lot for $50 of the new British military currency and traced the route of the women back to the barracks. There, I learned many loads had already been carried off. Others had been thrown into a bonfire by Gurkha soldiers who had first occupied the rooms where the archives had been stored, and what remained were piled up as legs for stretcher beds or props for tables. In the post-war years, there was an attempt to try to collate what exactly went missing during the wartime period. So, in fact, the Lay's guides that initially I showed you image of the cover of, you will notice that there are a lot of different handwritten annotations on them. So you see markings in red, saying what were missing. You see markings in blue saying what we found on I guess January 1952. There are little ticks and little annotations. So I did do a little compilation of all these little annotated volumes, and there were about 288 volumes that went missing during the wartime period based on these annotations. Some of them, thankfully, were 288 is after minusing off those that they were found in 1952. What's National Archives? So after the war, in the post-war years, so during the wartime interlude, there wasn't any archivist. Tan CHYE was out of a job. He basically, we don't quite know what happened to him, but he was re-employed in 1946 when the British returned. And he was also given a scholarship to study history in the Department of History in the Raffles College that later on became the University of Malaya. That is now the basis of the National University of Singapore. And during the post-war years, he very actively was engaged in giving public talks. He wrote articles about Singapore's early colonial history. He published in the Journal of the Malayan branch of the Royal Asiatic Society, quoting extensively from this particular set of the Straits Settlements Records. But in 1953, he was transferred out of the Raffles Museum and Library, and he was posted to the Customs Department, where he became controller, and very rapidly sort of rose through the ranks, and later on became quite a prominent person within the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and then as well as in the Singapore business community subsequently. In fact, a very interesting sort of like postscript to this entire story of Tan CHYE is that he was subsequently sort of serving on the National Archives and Records Committee in the 1960s, where he sort of served a brief period as a sort of like advisor to the archives or what we should collect and keep. So the Straits Settlements Records sort of did not have a caretaker in that sense, and the collection became administered by the reference section of the Raffles Library. But that's not to say that the archives languished, because it continued to be a very fertile source of primary source material for the history department at the University of Malaya. So professors were sort of like encouraging a new generation of historians to engage with this particular set of collections, and also it's sort of to explore this colonial history, and it's also it became sort of like a nationalist call as well, to use materials that are based within Singapore in order to write Singapore's colonial history, Singapore and Malaya's colonial history. And in 1967, finally, there was a attempt to set up a national archives. And they invited a UNESCO expert, Dr. Verhoeven, who visited Singapore to advise on this creation of an Archives and Records Center. So the cover of the act that was eventually passed in 1967 is shown on the top right. And Dr. Verhoeven is not actually a stranger to Singapore and its archives, or to the Straits Settlements Records for that matter, because way back in 1937, the director of the Raffles Museum and Library, when they were thinking of setting up the archives department, they actually wrote to him in Batavia, where he was the chief archivist, to seek his advice on how to select an archivist. And his advice was qualifications weren't as important as being history-minded. And he even offered to host the future Straits archivists in Batavia to talk about things in general. And in the end, Tan CHYE actually was sent to Batavia for about 2 weeks to learn some basics of archiving before he was sent back to Singapore to start on his work to do the index to the Straits Settlements Records. Now, after the report from Verhoeven in 1967, the National Archives and Records Center officially began functioning in 1968, and was functioning out of a room within the National Library. So you have here the image of the National Library on the bottom left. In 1970, we moved to a little colonial bungalow in Lewin Terrace, just a few buildings away from where we currently are. And there you see this little van that has National Archives and Records Center printed on it, where we used to transfer records using. In 1984, the archives moved to the Old Hill Street Police Station. which now I think most of you might look on fondly as the building with very colorful windows. And in 1997, we finally had our very own building to house not just the Straits Settlements Records by then, but many other transfers from various government agencies and departments in the old Anglo-Chinese primary school, which we currently are still in. So now that I've given you sort of a brief history of the Straits Settlements Records, we'll talk about how to access or to research into the Straits Settlement Records. So there are a couple of finding aids to the Straits Settlement Records. One of them that is quite general and at quite a high level is this called the List of Straits Settlement Records. You'll see that on the shelves in the archives reading room, the ones that are facing the AVA room, which is where I'm currently at. And I've got here how it will look like. So it looks quite nondescript, sort of like a cloth bound volume. But if you look very closely, there's actually like list of Straits Settlements Records. And it's organized, it sort of lists, very broadly speaking, what are the various types of Straits records that cover the Straits Settlements period. And it lists down like what are the microfilm numbers that you will find them in, what is the time period that it covers, what is the call number of some of these records. But it doesn't contain a document level index, which means that each of these sort of like title that you see, letters from native rulers, letters to native rulers, is just a very vague description of a bound volume that's titled as that. But it doesn't tell you exactly what kinds of letters are found within it or what the titles of each of these documents. But it's a good start to the general overview of it. The Tan CHYE index covers only specifically the 1800 to 1867 set of Straits Settlements records, the founding collection of it. And it only covers the A to Z series, although actually in the latest detailed listing, it actually covers from AA to HH, but that is not indexed by Tan CHYE. And it's actually also not a comprehensive or complete index, but it remains to today one of the best sort of document level index that we have to this particular set of records. It's organized alphabetically by keywords and it correlates to a specific volume. So as I mentioned, this is a handwritten, this is how it looks like handwritten. And now that we have computerized it or rather typed it out, you do have like a general overview listing of like which are the series and what are the microfilm numbers for them. And each of these sort of key is organized alphabetically by keywords, and each of these keywords will have a sort of title, and then each of these title will have a LAYS reference number. So whether it's in volume I-24, for instance, and covers the year, it comes this particular document of East India Companies about servants prohibited from having any connection with newspapers. I-24, so it covers the year, it was from the year 1826 and it's found on page 64, 65, for instance. And you will see that it is actually a very thick, it's much thicker finding aid. So this is what you will see in the archives reading room. This is a sample, this is my finger, yeah, so it's actually quite thick. Thankfully, we actually have it online now, so you can actually do a Control-F search. So if you scan the QR code down here, you will actually be redirected to the Archives Online link to where the scanned version of this Tan CHYE index is. And you can try to hunt down the papers of interest to you. So how do you use the index? Basically, you identify based on the keywords, the relevant entry of interest, take down the page number and the volume number. You can search for the volume number on Archives Online. If you don't already see a PDF, although I think now most of the PDFs should have already been uploaded, you'll be able to actually view it immediately online and you do not have to place an e-request at all. So once you view the record itself, notice that at the top right-hand corner, there's a page number listed on it. So it can be a bit faint, so I have enlarged it. You can see how tiny it is. And from the page number, you'll actually be able to see the document. I do advise that sometimes you read a bit before and a bit after just to get a fuller context of the background behind this particular letter that is being written. Yeah, so with that, I'll pass on to my colleague Christabel, who will bring you on a more exciting ride on some of the highlights of how the Straits Settlements records have been used and some of the highlights of the Straits Settlements records itself. Christabel?
Hi everyone. Thank you, Fiona, for that really interesting sharing. So for my part today, I'll be sharing about how we activate the collection via this very exciting initiative called the Citizen Archivist Project. So what is the Citizen Archivist Project? The Citizen Archivist Project is a crowdsourcing website that invites the public to help make our records more discoverable and accessible, and also to enrich our collection through several tasks that you can find on the website. The URL is www.nas.gov.sg/citizenarchivist, and what you see here is the landing page of the website. You can see the task there. There is uploading a sound clip to Soundscape SG, translate dialect recordings, transliterating Jawi newspapers. But what we want to focus on today is transcribed documents, which is you can find, if you scroll down to the end of the page. So next page, please. So we have uploaded many volumes of the Straits Settlement Records to be transcribed. As you can see from the picture there, the handwritten and elaborate cursive handwriting is unable to be picked up accurately by OCR or optical character recognition. So it impedes searchability. So by tapping on the public's collective effort, the stories and content that come out from these records can be available for searching and reading in a shorter span of time. So if you scroll down below, you can see this carousel where you can look at the many volumes of the SSR that have been uploaded, and you can see at the top right-hand corner the volume number, which I think earlier Fiona shared with you how to go about determining which volume you want to be looking at. So when you click on a page, you can see this is what it looks like. There's a little text box on the right where you can start transcribing. It's very high-res image of the SSR, so you can zoom in, and you don't need to sign up for an account. You can just log in with your Gmail or Facebook or your My Library account, and you can immediately start transcribing. Right. So we have launched this project since March 2015, and since the very beginning, the transcribed records have been very high quality, right? As you can see from this example over here. Maybe I talk a bit about the story on the left. It's about tigers in Singapore. So in the past, I mean, based on these records, you can see that you can get a sense of what life was like in early Singapore. So in the past, Singapore is actually famous for having tigers roaming around the island and killing people. So in this letter, the police is actually asking for funds to spread some on animals so that when the tigers eat them, they will get poisoned and they will die. So it was such a bad problem that even up to the 1860s, and it was such a terrible problem that the police had to go to such extents. So next slide, please. Right, so for those volumes that have been completed, they will be progressively uploaded onto Archives Online. So you don't need to request for it. You can just head to the website and view it anytime, as long as you have an internet connection. So close to 37,000 pages have been transcribed by our citizen archivists, and 72 volumes have been uploaded onto Archives Online to reveal a vast amount of new knowledge. And with this, obviously, over time, we will have a new perspective and have different focus. And it's also more accessible for the younger generation who can't read cursive handwriting. Next slide, please. So through the tireless and selfless work of our citizen archivists, we have fascinating stories being revealed, and this has been invaluable to our understanding of Singapore's history. What we have here is this story by one of our citizen archivists, Ms. Vandana. So she had managed to sketch out the life story of one Kunuk mystery, who is a convict who was sent here in Singapore in 1825. And he was assigned to be a dresser at the Paupers Hospital, which is the present-day Tan Tock Seng Hospital. So throughout his sentence, he had kept all his testimonials and character references, which he had earned from various British doctors and prison wardens. And in the end, he sent a petition to request to go back to India to die by the Ganges. But unfortunately, by the time it was possible, because of his poor health, he could not make it back, and his death was reported in the Free Press and Mercantile Advertiser. And it was said that he had left as much as 50,000 to his sons. So this is a story that Vandana had managed to sketch out across by transcribing across different volumes, and also this is the kind of social histories that have emerged from the SSR. And without the Citizen Archivist Project and without the work of our citizen archivists, we may have forgotten about these stories of individuals, right? So next page, please. So this is a photograph of our citizen archivists. So they are a very dedicated bunch of, a small community of dedicated transcribers. And one of them have even set up a website called the Citizen Archivist Sharing, where she has put up a guide such as alphabet, how to read cursive, notable people that are mentioned in the SSR, terms and expressions that are obviously different today, and places of interest, and so much more. So the website is at nasguide.wordpress.com. If you want to start transcribing, you can take a look and also share your experiences. So some of the feedback that we have gotten from our citizen archivists is, so one of them says, as I continue transcribing the Straits Settlement Records, I'm learning more about Singapore's past that relates to the present and see how far we have progressed. I also hope my efforts will make those researching on Singapore's story easier. So another one says, thank you for the opportunity to transcribe important collections of papers in the National Archives. As a lifelong student of history, it is overwhelming for me to read original transcripts and an honor to have the privilege of transcribing them. I feel like an important participant in what happened 200 years ago. So, so the SSR, as they inform our understanding, of Singapore's history under colonial rule, which is obviously a very big part of our history, they have been displayed in many exhibitions, from those that outline the early introduction of English law into Singapore at Law of the Land at the National Gallery of Singapore, to the signatures of Indian traders in Indian Heritage Centre's exhibition, to a name list of the Singapore's earliest police forces, right? But tonight I will be focusing on and sharing about what was highlighted at one of NLB's very own exhibitions called On Paper, Singapore Before 1867, which featured a whopping number of 11 volumes of the Straits Settlement Records, which is the biggest number ever exhibited. So here we have the classics. On the left, that's the record of the 1819 Treaty of Friendship and Alliance, also known as the Treaty of Singapore. So this is a handwritten copy of the 1819 Treaty of Friendship and Alliance, and it was signed on 6th of February 1819 between Raffles, who was representing the British East India Company, or EIC, and Singapore's Malay rulers, Sultan Hussein Shah and Tumangong Abdul Rahman. So this treaty expanded on a preliminary treaty, or a preliminary agreement that was signed on 30th of January between Raffles and Tumangong. And it allowed the British to set up a trading post in Singapore. So this treaty did not actually make Singapore a British colony, and it was only in 1824 that Singapore was ceded in to the British. So you can see that on the right. So it says, Their Highnesses, the Sultan Hussein Muhammad Shah and Datu Tumangong Abdul Rahman Sri Maharaja hereby cede in full sovereignty and property To the Honourable, the English East India Company, their heirs and successors forever, the island of Singapore, situated in the Straits of Malacca, together with the adjacent seas, straits, and islets, to the extent of 10 geographical miles from the coast of the said main island of Singapore. So if you want to see, this treaty is actually still at the NAS Exhibition Law of the Land that is at the National Gallery. So the location of both of these important treaties are actually still unknown, and what remains is what you see here. They are scribal copies made for record purposes. So the next slide, please. Right here we have the extract statement of the principal articles of import and export during the year 1826. So this was recorded in 31st of January 1827. And it's a very interesting list of items that you can see that were coming in and out of Singapore, including dragon's blood, which is a resin. So a reading of the data shows that an overwhelming proportion of the goods were imported and then exported in the same year, meaning that most of the goods that arrived in Singapore were destined for export elsewhere, with only a small amount set aside for local consumption. So this particular list on the left is signed by William Scott, after whom Scott's Road is named, and he was the harbour master and postmaster of Singapore. And he also owned property and nutmeg plantations around the area where Scott's Road now stands. Next slide, please. So this is the census of Singapore's population in 1828. This is the earliest one we can find in the SSR, but we know that there was another one that was done in 1824. So it features a breakdown of the demographics by race or ethnicity and an overall tally of the population. You can see that sizable number of convicts were in Singapore, since the Straits Settlements, they were penal settlements to continental India. So as you can see, they show the disparity between the sexes, right? Particularly in the Chinese community, as the immigration of women of China was not only illegal, but also socially unacceptable. So even when immigration laws were relaxed in 1859, it was only many years later before a greater number of respectable women came to Singapore, and the only Chinese women were of mixed blood or young prostitutes imported by secret societies. So so you can see the great imbalance in the Chinese, European, and Indian communities. And so in the Chinese community, the men did not bring along their families with them, as they did not intend to permanently settle in Singapore. So also you should, the head counts actually done in the early years were not accurate, because due to the limitations of the time, and this is caused by inaccessible the inaccessible nature of the people who are living in the interior, the migratory nature of the population, the language barrier, and just people have been suspicious of these police officers coming to take their information. So it was reported in 1833 that it was not possible for 2 constables attached to this settlement to devote, in addition to their many other duties, to make minute inquiries at every house and at every district. And also, according to Thomas Bradell, he said that the numbers cannot be relied on, because the numbers under the heading Europeans and their descendants, there was no fixed principle to be followed in making the census. And some offices included whoever was wearing European clothes, and some who included all Christians. And so it's not obviously accurate. So in the 1849 census, 27,495 Chinese people were stated to profess the Buddhist religion, but in a Singapore Free Press article, it states that So well-informed Chinese informed that the number is actually 15 and not more than 29,000, and the great majority were Confucians. So obviously there was language barrier, and so the census are prone to serious errors, right? So, however, in spite of the limitations and inaccuracies, these are perhaps the only statistics that can chart the growth and change in composition of Singapore's population, and it reveals how Singapore's society evolved as a result of successive waves of migration. So it was only in 1867 when the transfer of settlement of Singapore was transferred to the Colonial Office. The first proper modern census as we know it was conducted in 1871. So that was more comprehensive and reliable than before. Okay, next. Sorry. Okay, here we have a letter from Farquhar, who was the resident of Singapore, and he was saying that he does not want a Bugis prince, Arong Bilawa, to be extradited to Riau, which was controlled by the Dutch. So this came about because Bilawa's brother was put to death by the Dutch in Riau for alleged treason. So Bilawa rebelled, and he had to take refuge in Singapore with 500 of his followers. So it was said that the first appearance on the horizon of these fierce, warlike Bugis, as they are known to be, terrified the inhabitants of Singapore. But they came with women and children, and it was a balanced community. So they were relieved to know that these people are coming to settle and not to raid the island. So for many years, Bugis traders, they dominated the commerce of the eastern islands of the archipelago. They flocked to Riau, where they were also strongly entrenched politically, and so that was possibly one of the reasons why Farquhar did not want to hand him over, because he was thinking that could attract more trade to Singapore. So, and this was also the largest single body of immigrants, and Farquhar was delighted, to welcome them. And so he granted them asylum in Singapore, where they built their kampong on Rochor River, and the Dutch later permitted Bilawa to return to Riau. But many of them chose to remain in Singapore, and it soon became the headquarters of Bugis trade in the Western Archipelago. Next slide, please. Okay, so beyond the politics and statistics, we also have nuggets of interesting sights and sounds of Singapore that we can glean from the SSR, such as the beat of Gong, which is what they use to announce proclamations or announcements or even advertisements. So on the left, we have this notice or instruction from Farquhar to Bonham, the assistant to the resident. He said, "The enclosed proclamation in the Chinese and Malay languages having been transmitted to me by Sir Stamford Raffles for general information, I have to request you will be pleased to cause the same to be proclaimed by beat of Gong, and copies thereof fixed up in the usual places as with little delay as possible." And this instruction is dotted all over SSR when there were announcements to be made. So the one on the right, it was to announce it was to announce the establishment of the local magistracy to take effect. So you can imagine the beating of gong in Singapore and notices being put up and people coming to read these notices that were translated in Malay and Chinese languages. And the instructions usually say they are to be affixed at the usual places for public information. But there's one particular record that specifically states where they are to be affixed to, and that is Kampong Glam and Kampong China. Next slide, please. So these records that are kept by the colonial government, they are obviously naturally reflect the concerns of colonial rulers. And there are generally very few records that have information that provide, that are from the perspectives of various communities that were residing in early Singapore before 1867. But through their official dealings with the authorities, they get documented in the SSR, and we can learn more about the inhabitants of the island. Like, for example, this petition that was submitted by some Chulia merchants. So the Chulia community had requested for headmen to be appointed for their different classes, like the mercantile and laboring classes, to quoted, facilitate the execution of all government orders, as well as arrange affairs amongst ourselves, so to settle disputes and to keep the peace. So earlier correspondence from Farquhar showed that a general meeting was held at the Residency in December 1822 to select eligible headmen. But this particular petition, which is signed by 66 native merchants and laborers, they did not agree with the selection by Farquhar. So it says that they are not altogether agreeable with the government selection of the 3 men in each class. And they were petitioning instead for their choice of Narayana Pillai as headman for the merchants and Kai Mutula for the coolies and boatmen. So these are interesting, glimpses into how people have tried to take control of their lives. And in another petition by Chinese residents, they were told to tear down their houses, their dwellings, and they were not. It says they are really at a loss to know how they are to be defrayed for what. I'm sorry. Yeah, so it says, now your petitioners have been given to understand that orders have been issued that all your petitioners' buildings are to be taken down. Your petitioners formed their industry and hard labor, and from what your petitioners were able to secure, they erected these buildings, and now they are really at a loss. So your petitioners being poor and having no fund to place their inhabitation, they will be very glad if their buildings are removed for the purpose of opening roads and other government buildings, but not merely to distress the poor industrious inhabitants and give their place to the richer class. So we don't have the conclusion to this petition, to these petitions that the local communities have sent in, but it's just fascinating to know that they have tried to take control of their lives and not, just listening to what their colonial masters have ordered. Next, please. Next slide, please. Sorry. So so there are a series of letters exchanged by a very outraged James Pearl to the Lieutenant L.N. Hull, who was the secretary to the Lieutenant Governor in India. And he was very enraged that he had bought several plots of land of plantation from Chinese Gambia plantation owners, and he said that they had police had violently came into his dwellings and tried to take his possessions. So, James Pearl is the captain of the Indiana, and he first brought Raffles to Singapore. And because he had later made a good profit trading in and out of Singapore, he decided to settle in Singapore, and he bought up these Chinese Gambia plantations, and he built a house on that hill. So it was originally called Mount Stamford after Raffles. But because of this, so Raffles had argued that Pearl had not sought prior approval for the land, and he did not. But in response, Pearl asserted that the Chinese landowners had acquired their land from the local rulers prior to the arrival of the British, and that Pearl had sought the approval of the Tumangong before purchasing the land from the Chinese. And so to support his claim, he went to the police and he extracted this from the public records registry, and he left several written receipts from each of the landowners. As you can see, this is one where it's signed by Tan Lu, and it's witnessed by the Chinese Captain Housing and Chang Hao and Inche Leba Penghulu Husan. So eventually, the hill was ceded back to Pearl, but then he renamed it from Stamford Hill to Pearl's Hill. Obviously, not very happy. So with that, thank you.